Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started since we have a narrow window before Isha prayers. On behalf of the ICCP, I'd like to welcome all of you to this voter education and sort of political empowerment session that we wanted to host tonight. The impetus for doing this comes from two things, at least from my standpoint. Ever since October 7th, people have been coming up to board members here and to each other and asking, like, what can we do? Like, how can we, like, get our voices heard and fight back a little bit, to be honest? It's become even worse as we see what's happening on college campuses and our kids getting beaten up and our rights trampled right and left and not really feeling like we have a voice. And so we have a stark election coming up. And it's obvious that we need to figure out some way to work through this. The second thing that sort of was important to me was actually an informal poll that Imam Rafai did about 2 months ago at Jummah prayer one day, where he looked at the audience, where there's at least 200 people on this floor alone, and asked how many of you guys voted in the primaries last time. And only about 10 people put their hands up. And I looked around and said, man, we've got some work to do. And so, inshallah, here we are tonight. I'd really like to thank the management of the ICCP for hosting and looking ahead and trying to get this done. We are primarily a spiritual organization, and that's going to be our focus. We're going to stay truly functionally neutral and work along those lines. Nobody here is going to tell you who to vote for from the ICCP standpoint, but we all believe, I feel, that having a well-educated congregation that is empowered and thoughtful about our political process is really important for us, both as a community here, as an ummah at large, and then for our nation and for the world, because we can make a difference. We're very close to the center of power, and inshallah, we should put our efforts behind that. And so, again, thank you to the ICCP for hosting. One thing that a lot of people have asked was, oh, can we start some new organization? And I feel like, no. Organizations are a dime a dozen. A lot of them don't work. Let's look at people who have put in the time and put in the effort and try to work with them and put our resources together so we become a stronger ummah rather than a more divided one. So inshallah, we have a great team tonight. We're really proud of the program we put together. We have the Montgomery County Muslim Council, which is our local organization that has done a lot with building inroads to county and state elected officials. And then we have MPAC, which has a national reach. Inshallah, we can figure out ways to work with them to make this whole thing better. So with that, we'll start within just a minute. I want to introduce Amin bin Al-Taifa. He's my little brother here who really helped a lot with getting this set up and put a lot of work and effort into this. He has great, amazing organization skills, although most of us only know him for getting ahead of us in the line in Jummah prayer and somehow getting in the first or second row. I don't know how. But alhamdulillah, he's good on all those counts. So Amin is going to introduce the Montgomery County Muslim Council team, and we'll start our presentation with that.
Jazakallah, Brother Mustafa. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amin bin Al-Taifa. I have the honor of serving on the board of the Montgomery County Muslim Council, colloquially referred to as MCMC. For those of us who may not know, Montgomery County Muslim Council is really focused on civic engagement, educating the community on such related topics, and really helping drive our community forward in that arena, inshallah. Now, I would like to keep it brief because I know we have a lot to go over. I'd like to next introduce Brother Asif Hussein, who is our president at MCMC. He will walk us through the first part of our program this evening, inshallah, which is really focused on local and state level politics and education around the same. Brother Asif has been a member of MCMC for almost 8 years, serving as a president for the past 6. Prior to serving as president, Mr. Hussein has been serving on the MCMC board of directors. Professionally, Brother Asif Hussein leads information security and compliance strategy for the public sector practice at Smartsheet, a cloud-based SaaS provider in collaborative work management space. Mr. Hussein possesses an MBA from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia, as well as a master's and bachelor's degree from Carnegie Mellon University. Brother Asif is married with 3 daughters, all born and raised in Montgomery County. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Brother Asif.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As way too formal of an intro there, Amin. I'm just a guy. I'm part of your community. Although not necessarily ICCP all that often, but a wonderful new facility I'm seeing since the last time I've come. So first of all, thank you to the ICCP board and to the community members for hosting this event and having us participate. Greatly appreciate that. I know our time is limited, so I have a lot of slides. I'm going to skip a lot of them because of the time, but I think the general message, inshallah, will be conveyed. So a little bit about MCMC. As Amin mentioned, we're really focused on representing the voices of our Muslim community, primarily here locally in Montgomery County, but as needed, also at the state and even at the national level as necessary, as warranted. We are one of actually 7 councils around Maryland. It's a kind of a really unique model that we've got set up here in Maryland. Not to say that we're any better than any other state. Everyone's got different things that are going on, but there are similar councils in like Howard County, Prince George's County, Frederick County, Anne Arundel County, Baltimore County, and then there's a statewide United Maryland Muslim Council as well. We were established early 2000s, shortly after 9/11. I think many of you know our founders, Dr. Aqilur Rahman, Tufail Ahmed were the primary founders. We have Mr. Shafiq Khan here as well, who was one of our early founders as well. And we're just basically trying to continue the mission that they had started back in the early 2000s. We are a 501c4, so not a 501c3 that many of you are maybe familiar with in terms of the masajids and a lot of other nonprofits. And what the 501c4 setup does is it allows us to actually engage in political-based activity, but still as a nonprofit, but we're not a tax-deductible entity, if that makes sense. We are organized with a board of directors and then a membership. And I'm not here to promote our membership, et cetera, but certainly if anyone's interested, talk to us afterwards. Our board is made up of 9 members. And as a board, we make the ultimate kind of decisions that in terms of various engagements, activities, et cetera, that we will choose to engage in. Just some idea, just to give you an idea of the types of activities that MCMC has engaged in recently, but over the years as well. We're talking a lot about political or civic engagement right now. It's a presidential election year. There's a primary scheduled next week. We'll get into that in a second. But we've conducted a lot of different types of candidate forums, not just this election cycle, but in last election cycle, meaning for various races, getting all of the candidates together, going through a question and answer type of session. One, for them to be educated, meaning the candidates, on who we are as Muslims in Montgomery County and what are our agenda items, what are the things that are most important to us, but it's also a way for us as a community to be educated on who these candidates are and who will ultimately best serve our needs and our purposes. In terms of right now, I know there's probably 2 big things that galvanize our community that are bringing people out. For those who may say, hey, I'm not really politics and all that, that's not my thing, right? Obviously, the situation in Gaza, the ongoing conflict in the Palestinian occupied territories, it's unfathomable, and we all are feeling like we need to do something. The other item that's come up a lot related to Gaza, but also not, is sort of the situation that is becoming not so tenable for our children or for those of us who have children in Montgomery County public school systems, right? So these are some of the types of engagements that we've been engaged in, whether it's with the county council, with members of the Board of Education, things of that nature. So let me just move on for the sake of time here. Our strategic vision for 2024. So today is May 6th, okay? Most people, if I'm guessing correctly, are probably well aware of the November 5th general election. Why? Because it's a presidential election. You hear the question all the time, man, we got Trump, we got Biden. I don't know what to do, right? What I'm here to sort of position as of today, as of May 6th, and just give us time, bear with us, right, is in the world of politics, November 5th is ages away. I mean, these couple months, it's a long time. What's most important right now is the primary election, which is May 14th. Why is that? Because in Maryland law and the way primaries work in most states, on a party-by-party level, Democrat, Green Party, Republican, what have you, the primary is where amongst the party, the candidates are running against each other to determine who from the party will be represented in the general election. So it is important in a general sense. It's even more important in Maryland. And the reason I'll say this, and I want to preface my entire portion of our conversation this evening to reinforce the fact that I'm speaking on behalf of Montgomery County Muslim Council, MCMC. I'm not speaking on behalf of ICCP or any other organization. So just to be very, very clear. Why the primary is even more important is because we live in Maryland and we live in Montgomery County. And the reality, whether you like it or not, is this is a heavily Democrat-controlled area, right? So what ends up happening traditionally over years and decades in Maryland and Montgomery County is the candidates, specifically from the Democratic Party, I'd say 9 times out of 10, that come out of the primary, they're going to win in the general election. We're not talking about the presidential election. That's a completely different situation, right? But in terms of, you know, our local, our members of Congress, our senators, our congresspeople, state delegates, you name it down the line, the primary is where that's determined. So it's really important for us as a community. If we want our voices to be heard, if we want to be represented properly, we need to vote in the primary election. And traditionally, we do not vote. Our community does not vote in the primary election. 2 months ago, Imam Rafai asked the question, right? There's like, was 10% of the crowd maybe raise their hands, right? So we need to be better. We need to hold ourselves accountable and responsible for that. How do we do that, right? Mashallah, we're a growing community. We're large in numbers in Montgomery County, right? But we're unorganized. We're scattered. And so the quote unquote big fish that are out there that are sort of running the show, if you will, they eat us up because they know, you know, they may come speak to us at, you know, at Eid or at a Jummah or what have you, and then we never see them again, and they feel, yeah, that I got their vote because they saw me once, right? But if we organize ourselves and we work together such that we're all voting together, we can eat the big fish, right? Just keep that in mind in terms of our need and our ability to organize and work together as a community has the potential to have tremendous power, but the action's on us. How do we gain influence? Influence is going to be by several items, and I'm going to really touch upon 1 or 2 of these items. Yes, there's a money factor. You can't deny that, but I'm not going to focus on that too much tonight. Engagement. How much are we being involved? How much are we going out, meeting with our local elected representatives? How much are we having them come to our communities? And not just for photo ops, but to really engage, to let them know, here's what's bothering us, here's what needs we have, or even congratulating them when they do things that work well for us so they know they have our support. We don't engage often enough, right? We need allies. We need to work with others. We need to have partners. You know, I'll hold ourselves accountable. MCMC, we need to work better with MPAC and others, right? It's when we come together is when we have more power. And of course, the easiest thing that all of us can do, forget the money, forget the partnerships, forget even the engagement, as long as we vote, then the politicians and civic leaders, they'll come to us. They know that if we can influence who gets in office for whatever the seats are, we're not chasing them anymore. They're coming to us. And that's when the game changes. So for those of you who have not yet registered to vote, we have a QR code up here that and actually the registration to vote piece is actually, the deadline has passed. It was actually April 23rd, but the QR code is still important. Why? Because of a couple things. One, if you're not registered to vote, Maryland law still says that, so right now, you are able to do a mail-in voting for those who have requested mail-in ballots. And as of last Thursday through this coming Thursday, through May 9th, early voting has started. And Maryland law allows you to register same day and vote same day. So if anyone's not yet registered, get the information and register and vote. If you want to change your party affiliation, that's something you can't do now. That deadline's passed, right? But you can also use this QR code to find out where do I go to vote, if I need to change my address, things of that nature. And we'll pull this up later again at the end of the program today. I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides to move forward. So I just wanted to give a general idea, right? So part of the way things are structured, it's meant to confuse the community. And I'm going to show you a couple different maps of Montgomery County, and it'll just kind of illustrate how things are confusing. So this is the map of your congressional districts, of how your representation in Congress, right? So you've got different districts, you know, around the county. And let me just ask real quick, and we'll build this out. Does everyone know who our two senators are? Please tell me you know your two senators, right? Yeah, Cardin and Van Hollen. Now Cardin's really interesting because he's retiring, right? So it's a rare opportunity in any state, but for us here in Maryland, where we have a Senate race where there's no incumbent. You know, oftentimes an incumbent, it's hard to defeat an incumbent. So we have an opportunity as a community to significantly influence who will be our next junior senator. And when that person gets in, whoever that will be, chances are they're there for years and years and years, right? Again, very important for us to engage in the primary. Who's your congressperson from where ICCP is? Your representative in Congress? Your District 6, this is in District 6, which is David Trone. So anyone said Raskin, we got to fix that. We got to get ourselves educated. Now, here's the map, and I'm going to go through this quick because I know I'm sort of out of time, but here's the map for our Maryland state legislative body, right? It's a completely different map, right? The maps aren't the same, and so you get confused. Like now, so ICCP is District 6 in Congress. Your Maryland legislative representation is, here, build this out. You're actually in District 16 when it comes to our state legislative body, right? Your state senators, Ariana Kelly, you have 3 delegates, one of whom is Sarah Wallach. For those of you who may, hopefully most of you know that she's one of your representatives here in the district for ICCP, part of our community, right? Same thing, our county council, completely different map, right? Completely different map. You know, your representatives, now you're in District 1 when it comes to the county council, right? District 6, District 16. And so your council member that represents District 1 is actually currently the council president, Andrew Friedson, and you have 4 at-large members. Board of Education, again, completely different map, right? So what I'm getting at is we need to educate ourselves of how these, if not the maps, but just who represents us, whether it's ICCP or where your home is, so that we can engage properly, right? And so from the Board of Education perspective, you're in District 3 here at ICCP. Your representative is Julie Yang, and then there's 2 at-large members as well. And there's 3 actually open seats on the Board of Education which will be contested during the primaries. There's an at-large seat, and there's a District 2 and a District 4 race. In fact, so Julie Yang is not up for re-election, but Lynn Harris is up for re-election, right? You have an opportunity, whether you want to keep her or not. We have some opinions on that, but I'll hold that for the time being. So I'm just going to skip through a couple of these other questions or slides. So we do have a voter guide, and again, I'll preface this. This is the MCMC voter guide. This is not the ICCP voter guide. I believe we've been handing some of these out at the past Jumas here at ICCP. So I'm not going to keep this up, but we can bring this up at a later point in terms of who Montgomery County Muslim Council is recommending for all of these open seats. And again, we can bring this up at a later time as well. But some action items and next steps for everyone to take, right? Again, one, we have a survey. So I'd love everyone to pull out your phones, grab this QR code. This survey is essentially going to allow you to get on MCMC's mailing list, right? When we're holding candidate forums, when we have various events, we need to get better at communicating out to our community in terms of what these events are, whether it's our events or we want to make you aware of other organizations' events, right? So please get on our mailing list, and that will help us better serve you as well. Secondarily, if you'd like to become a member of MCMC and participate in some of the our annual meetings and what have you, to vote on specific actions and activities that we're taking, I would love for everyone to become a member. So there's a QR code for membership. We're really not in the area of fundraising. Again, we're a 501c4. We operate on a very, very low budget. But for anyone who may feel the urge to help us with a few dollars here and there to help with a lot of our overhead costs, you can also support us through a small donation. Here's your register to vote QR code one more time. So we, again, at a later point, we'll pull this up. And with that, I am probably well over my time, but I'll stop there. So I don't know if we want to hold questions for the time being. We'll do that later. Okay. So I'm going to then hand it over to our friends from MPAC.
Yeah, you don't have slides. Assalamu alaikum again, everybody. Thank you so much, Asif, for your great talk. For the next part, we're going to have representatives from the Muslim Public Affairs Council, or MPAC. And I'm going to first introduce Haris Tarin. Haris is an amazing, true American story. He left Afghanistan as a refugee at the age of 4 and ended up in California, and has done amazing work ever since. He's currently a senior policy advisor at the Department of Homeland Security and advises senior leadership on immigration, civil rights, civil liberties, and counterterrorism. Prior to this, he was director of the Washington, D.C. office of MPAC, and he's been a Cambridge Fellow and a Georgetown Fellow, and he's written several books, including an introduction to Muslim America, and co-authoring of Rethinking the Red Line, Free Speech, Religious Freedom, and Social Change. He's also a regular on news television programs such as CNN and BBC and Fox and MSNBC. And he's written a lot for newspapers and other organizations as well. So with that, I give you Haris.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mustafa, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the Center for hosting our conversation today. I think this is a really good model of having local folks, the local impact on our lives of civic engagement in the elections, and then also how the national scene and the international scene impacts our lives. Because to be honest, as Muslims, we, as American Muslims, we are impacted at various levels. We live at the local level. Our kids are impacted by the school, by school boards, by what happens at the very local level, but our lives are also impacted by what happens internationally. I'm sure many of you over the past few months have had difficulty processing what's going on. And so it's a good model for us to have this conversation. And so that's why we thought we would have this engagement with both MCMC and the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And I'll just briefly talk about, before I introduce our distinguished guest, I will briefly introduce the Muslim Public Affairs Council. MPAC is a national organization that has been around for many, many years, for over 25 years, and really focuses on the intersection of policy advocacy in Washington, D.C. And the focus of MPAC is to really try to get American Muslim voices at the nerve centers of influence and power in our country, whether that is in Washington, D.C., engaging members on the Hill, Capitol Hill, the administration. Just today, MPAC had a meeting at the Department of Justice with senior officials about what happened with the students, the pro-genocide students at UCLA, and the response of law enforcement agencies, and called on the Department of Justice to conduct an investigation into how the Los Angeles Police Department and other law enforcement agencies reacted to that incident at UCLA. So that's the type of work that MPAC does in Washington, D.C. MPAC also has a Hollywood bureau that focuses on engagement with that industry to ensure that American Muslim voices are represented in a way that makes sense and that is true to who we are as a community. I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my government capacity. I'm a volunteer for MPAC, and I work to promote their work. But the idea is to ensure that MPAC's voice is also out in the communities and engaged with folks like you as well, so that you understand the work that this organization does. Specifically tonight, our focus will be and our conversation will be on the impact of the presidential elections and what will happen in November and its impact on us as an American Muslim community and on foreign policy as well. And so to help us have that conversation, I wanted to introduce a very distinguished guest who was kind enough to join us this evening and who is quite accomplished in Washington, D.C. and in the policy space. Shadi Hamid is a columnist and member of the editorial board at the Washington Post and a research professor of Islamic studies at the Fuller Seminary. Previously, he was a longtime senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, one of the major think tanks in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of several books, including the most recent, The Problem of Democracy. His previous book, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Books on Foreign Affairs. In 2019, he was named as one of the world's top 50 thinkers by the Prospect magazine. He also is the co-founder of Wisdom of Crowds, a podcast, newsletter, and debate platform. He received his BS and MA from Georgetown, so he's a local. And he also received his PhD in political science from Oxford University. So we're really grateful to have Shadi with us, and we'll just have a conversation. I'll ask him a few questions, and then we'll open it up to a conversation with the audience as well. Thank you, Shadi, for being with us this evening. So I wanted to ask you, from your experience and the spaces that you're in and the conversations that you have with people on a regular basis, every election, people say that this is a consequential election. This election will change history, will change America, will change the trajectory of the country. We said that in 2020, we said that in 2016. Now we're saying it again in 2024. But this is a little bit personal for us as American Muslims and as immigrant communities. Can you talk to us a little bit about the consequences of this election? Whether it's a Biden presidency again, a Trump presidency, how will it impact our communities, and how will it also impact foreign policy and specific to what is happening today in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. Great to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. It's obviously a difficult time with a lot going on. So I'm glad that there are forums like this. I also learned a lot about Montgomery County, so that was an added benefit for me. I don't know if I've actually ever been properly in Montgomery County, even though I have lived here in DC for a long time. I've heard a lot about you guys, like the public school protests that happened last year. So people were like talking about you. So clearly something is going on here. So, so to yeah. So I don't love the whole. This is the most important election of our lifetimes because in practice, there can only be one most important election of your lifetime. And if we already use that up for 2020 and 2016, then I guess this is the third one. But it is possible that this will end up, there's no way to anticipate it, but we can look back 5 or 10 years from now and say, well, actually, 2024 was different. And I want to leave open the possibility that this could be consequential in a way that some of the previous elections weren't. And part of it has to do with, I think, the more difficult situation that Muslims find themselves in. And I would say that we are in a more vulnerable position today than we were certainly in 2020. I mean, at that time, Trump had largely moved away from talking about Muslims. He lost interest in us. People had kind of forgotten about us and moved on, and other things were consuming American politics. Obviously, 2016, the Muslim ban, so that was quite consequential. But I think we're returning to the kind of 2016 vibe, or even the post 9/11 vibe, where Muslims and Arabs and the Middle East are really at the forefront of conversation. And I was really hoping that that wouldn't be the case. Obviously, there was something like a little bit weird about like no one seeming to care about us all that much. And part of me was almost like, I wish people cared about us a little bit more. I guess we've gotten kind of what we wished for in some sense, for both better and worse. But obviously what happens, inshallah, the war, the actual, the first phase of the war will have ended by then. That's the hope. And then we'll be in a new phase, which might include rebuilding Gaza, what that actually looks like, what will be the new authority that takes power in Gaza and fills the vacuum. So I think that you'll have a lot of debates, ongoing debates for the next 4 years about what a post-war, post-conflict situation actually looks like. Worst case scenario, that this war, maybe in a more low intensity way, kind of continues in different stages and isn't actually over by the time the election happens. We can talk about, like, I'm not here to tell people how to vote or anything. I'm personally a big proponent of uncommitted voting. I'm a little bit more torn about how to vote on November 5th. I haven't made a decision yet, and honestly, I think it will be a game time decision. Like when I'm in the voting booth, I'm just gonna have to feel, because in the end, you have to live with yourself and you have to do something that feels in line with your own conscience and integrity. And that's a very personal decision to make. I have a suspicion of how I will end up voting, but I don't want to get into too much unless some of you are interested in talking about it. But any primaries, I think what I'm in support of and what I think will be valuable for a community, regardless of how people vote in the end on November 5th, is sending a very clear message that we can't be taken for granted as a community. And I think we sort of got to the point where there was a presumption that Muslims are going to vote for the Democratic Party. Maybe that was changing a little bit last summer, and we started to see a shift for completely different reasons. And we have to balance. Foreign policy is one key arena here, but then there's also the things that maybe don't seem as important now, but will probably be important again in terms of public education. I don't have kids, but if I did have kids, I'd be very concerned about how they would be taught on certain subjects at a very early age, and obviously that was a big issue here in Montgomery County. And ultimately, we have two I think unideal candidates, and at some level, it's going to be a lesser of two evils decision, no matter what way you cut it. And those are difficult things to ask and answer. Obviously, My guess is that not a lot of people here are going to be Trump voters, but abstaining that's the option, just to be clear. What I'm saying, I'm not sure what I'll do in the voting booth. It's not really Biden or Trump. It's Biden or, I guess, if I'm in the voting booth, I can't really abstain. So that's another consideration, is that maybe I'll have to decide before, like that day or the day before, like, okay, I'm just going to not go to the voting. I'm not going to go to my polling station, and that's a decision I'll make. I'm a DC resident, which means that my vote is sort of irrelevant. So that's why I think that will put me in a position to maybe vote my conscience more. Obviously, you all have a different decision to make. Well, Marilyn, remind me how it's pretty solid, right?
Pretty solid.
Okay.
Pretty solid.
Okay, well, there you go. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about, but that's sort of like maybe an overview of how, and I'll just also say, like, when I started at the Washington Post, which was just about 7 months ago, I started the week before October 7th. I mean, my hope was to move away. You know, I've worked on Middle East politics for a long time. I was hoping to shift my focus and to not be too consumed by all of that. And so I feel like a lot of us, we've been thrust back into a position where we have to really wrestle with these issues. And it's a reminder that the Middle East never really goes away. And, you know, Jake Sullivan, our esteemed national security advisor, 8 days before October 7th, he had this very memorable statement that some of you might be familiar with, where he said, this is a direct quote, if I recall it correctly, "The Middle East is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades." That's what he said 8 days before. And if we go back, there's other examples of this. Hillary Clinton, 2 weeks before Mubarak fell in the Egyptian revolution, 2 weeks before he fell on February 11th, 2011, she said, quote, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian regime is stable." Again, the reminder here is that whether we like it or not, as people who either directly or indirectly have ties to the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia, that the conflicts over there do find a way to affect us here as Americans. And we're just going to have to learn to live with that and find ways to make our voices heard, and figuring out how to be influential on both domestic policy and foreign policy, and thinking strategically on both fronts.
Thank you for that. If you have any questions, please start to think about them. I'll ask one more, maybe 2 questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. Shawwal, you talked about the fact that you've been working on the Middle East for a while. Can you talk about how a Biden versus a Trump presidency will impact Gaza specifically? The conflict, what you talked about, the rebuilding, the broader peace agreement with the other nations, whether it's Saudi and Egypt and normalization and all of that, and what it would mean for a Palestinian state. How would either presidency play out for a Palestinian state and Palestinian statehood? And what it would mean for Hamas as well, because they are now part of the equation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is where I'm torn. I have been intrigued by some of the arguments that, in a sort of counterintuitive way, Trump could be in. Is it plausible that Trump could be better than Biden post November 5th, after the election?
On this issue.
On this issue, to be clear, yeah. I think the argument that he could be better is based on the notion that Trump is unpredictable, and just the very fact that we're having this conversation, we're not sure what Trump will do, I think proves the point that it's really hard to know. Because sometimes, obviously, he was the one behind the Abraham Accords, seems to have very little empathy for Palestinians. The Abraham Accords, I think, is a big part of the story of how we came to where we are. And that is tied directly to Trump, although unfortunately, the Biden administration doubled down on the Abraham Accords. And that's something that we should, keep in our memory, that they took a bad policy and ran with it and actually made it the focal point of their approach in the Middle East, or one of the focal points, this kind of fantasy. Well, it's not a fantasy. It's perhaps possible normalization with Saudi Arabia, but of course that comes at the expense of Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. I mean, the whole idea behind the Abraham Accords is to effectively do an end run around Palestinians and say, forget about them. We're going to focus on the Gulf countries, dictatorships effectively, that don't represent their own people, that don't have popular buy-in, that you have a couple leaders at the top who will make a separate peace with Israel. That is the idea. So there's a lot there to be opposed to, or at the very least, quite skeptical of. And but the thing about Trump is he has also been very critical of Bibi, and said things about even a discomfort with the loss of civilian life. But the way he says it is that he doesn't like the optics of it. The media is covering Gazans being killed, and he doesn't like that. So it's not even that he really cares about Palestinians dying, it's that he has a certain way of thinking about media coverage and all of that. So is it plausible? The other argument, I think, is that Trump doesn't like being humiliated. So if Netanyahu kept on ignoring whatever Trump or the people around him say, that Trump would say, listen, like, I'm not we give, this is a transactional relationship. We give you arms, we give you weapons, at least respect what I'm saying as Trump, that kind of thing. But again, this is speculative, and I don't want to put too much stock in it, but just if we want to consider that side of the argument, that's my understanding of like what the argument would be. But ultimately, I think that that's putting a lot of stock in a lot of speculation and a lot of ifs. And so ultimately, I think Biden is terrible on this, but I think it's possible that he would be less terrible. And that's ultimately the kinds of calculations we have to be making. It's not who will be good or who will make us feel better about the policies, is that who might on certain aspects be less bad. That's one aspect. But a bigger thing is, I think, the fact that there are Arab and Muslim Americans in senior positions in the government, and the fact that they are there having a voice, that is not something you're going to have with a Trump administration. A Trump administration will have very few Muslims or Arabs in senior positions where they have a quote-unquote seat at the table. The very fact that you're in government now, I think, speaks to that. Now, can these senior Arab and Muslim Americans, are they able to actually change the policy in a fundamental way? No. But are they able to make things less bad on specific, discrete policy issues? On humanitarian aid, for example. So if we look more specifically at, has the Biden administration pushed on easing access to humanitarian aid? Yes, it has. Is that something that should make us happy or content? No. But is it better than less humanitarian aid? Probably. Again, none of this is going to be satisfying, but I know some of them are our friends who are there fighting the good fight internally, trying to make our policies less bad. And I just don't think we're going to even have that voice or that influence if Trump becomes president. And then we get to the whole issue of Trump doesn't really believe in anything resembling a fair idea of what a Palestinian state would look like. The Democratic Party, and again, so do we look at this as Biden, or do we look at it as the bureaucracy? Then there's a third level where we say that if Biden wins, there's also something called the Democratic Party. The only people who have called for a ceasefire are pretty much in the Democratic Party. The only people who are talking about Palestinians as if they're actual human beings, they're maybe not the majority of the Democratic Party, but they're a big chunk of the Democratic Party, including some of the rising progressives, people like Rouhana, Joaquin Castro, Pramila Jayapal, obviously AOC and the squad. At least you have people internally in the Democratic Party who are making that case. And even the pro-Israel members of the Democratic Party, like Senator Coons. Senator Coons, some of you might have seen, about a month and a half ago, was on national television saying that he would consider conditioning aid to Israel for the first time, that he's someone who would never consider that up until now, but he's been so affected by what's happening that maybe now is the time to make that part of the conversation. Nancy Pelosi, hardline pro-Israel for most of her career, signed a letter calling for a halt of arms transfers to Israel. No one in the Republican Party, or barely anyone, is making anything similar to that. So those are the three ways that I would look at it. There's Biden, the bureaucracy, the broader administration, and then the broader Democratic Party. So yeah, so hopefully that.
That does, that's really helpful. I'll open it up to folks in the audience. We have a few minutes left, and sure. Wonderful. I'll go ahead and start in the front, and then we'll take a question from back there, and I'll come to you as well, please. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Well, thank you very much. I'm Shafiq Khan from the Montgomery County Muslim Council, and we're very honored to have you guys here. It's an honor to have people like you in the positions you have right now. So the main question I have is, what is the reality of Muslim power? Our own view is that actually we punch way below our weight. I see in Montgomery County, our primary participation ranges from 8% of registered Muslim voters to, at best, it's been in the mid-20s, versus other communities where it's been as high as 75%. And when you look at the swing states, I personally believe that we have far more power than we know about. So let me ask you that.
Yeah, so I think that, well, first of all, I think that in primaries, the message has already been sent. I mean, I remember, so for example, the Michigan uncommitted vote, you know, being on Twitter the day after and seeing a lot of the commentary in places like the Washington Post, where there was a lot of concern about how to make sense of the uncommitted percentage. Now, people said it wasn't as much as maybe the hopes were, but it was still a significant number. And so to see that, and if not to say that's coming entirely from Muslim and Arab Americans, also, you know, young progressive leaning voters, but the fact that that can register in the national consciousness, and that did send a clear message to the Biden team, and they have been worried about this. And I internally, they have conversations about Michigan voters and to what extent that can actually tip the balance one way or the other. And that's why for the next few months, and when you guys all go to vote, I guess, in 2 weeks, I think there will be a lot of attention as to whether Muslim Americans were able to bring people out and to really have a solid showing. So I think that the fact that Muslims do tend to be more prevalent in certain swing states, that is something that we should be aware of, and that we should make use of. I will also say that if we make use of our role in swing states, and if Biden loses, just to give the other scenario, if Biden loses because enough of us abstain, like I'm considering, then I think that could also be, like, this is sort of a scorched earth policy that, you know, you'll have 4 years of Trump, and I don't want Trump for a lot of other reasons. So I think a lot of us would just be exhausted. We have to deal with this for 4 years, and it will be just, something that I'm frightened about. There's also Trump's lack of commitment to democratic outcomes. As someone who works on democracy in the Middle East, one of my big things is you respect democratic outcomes, even if they don't sort of turn out the way you want. But if it ends up that Biden loses by like a razor-thin margin, and places like Arizona and Michigan were able to tip the balance, then I think the message will be, people will be angry at us. Like, that's one thing to keep in mind. People will say, oh, Muslims played a role in this, and maybe that's a reason why Michigan went the other way and whatever it might be.
And will that impact our relationship with other communities and
Yeah,
minorities? And
it could hurt.
allies?
It could hurt the sort of patchwork coalition, the idea that we're all part of a party where, we help others and we try to keep an eye out for how other, marginalized groups will be affected. So I think there could be some blowback about that. On the other hand, people will know, like, don't mess with Muslims. You'll have, but again, I'm just saying that's maybe one way of looking at it. But just to say that the fact that people care about our vote in a way that in a way that I think is unprecedented, really tells us something about where we are as a community. And the fact too, when I was post 9/11, I was an undergrad, and it was very rare to know of any Muslims in senior positions in government. I think there was one that I was aware of, Hadi Amr, and he's still a senior official now. But besides him, like, you looked around, there was like pretty much no one. And Muslims in media, actually, the fact that we used to have, now we have two, but three anchors on MSNBC, Mehdi Hassan, Ali Velshi, and Ayman Mohyeddin. That's kind of incredible when you think about it. There was none of that happening 9/11. So I think that we have a kind of cultural power. I don't think it's been translated yet into pure politics. We're still, I think, struggling, but we're getting better at it. I think it troubles me that we don't have an equivalent to AIPAC yet. There's been a lot of talk about, like, what is the equivalent to AIPAC? We haven't been able to do that. We have a lot of different organizations that address different parts of the puzzle, but not a kind of umbrella organization that is effective. That concerns me. And obviously the same old story that we're still not good at giving a lot of money to political causes. There's still a kind of stinginess, if I can use that word, where maybe we give money on other things that are maybe more traditional concerns, but we don't, when it comes to politics, when it comes to organizing, we're not there yet. And I know that all of you are trying to change that through your own donation efforts, but that's still going to take some time.
No, and I usually, when I make a presentation about do a market analysis of American Muslim organizations versus Jewish American organizations, just to give you a couple of numbers. Last year, the ADL, which is the largest Jewish American advocacy organization in the country, their budget this past year was $103 million.
Wow.
$103 million. From previous year, which was at close to 80 million. If you compare that to like CARE or MPAC or Muslim Advocates or one of the organizations, all of them are less than $5 million annually, their national office. So the level of investment of communities translates to the impact and effectiveness of their institutions and how they impact policy. So that's a huge part of it. We just have not really invested in those areas of our civic and public life. For us, our priorities have, naturally have been, mosques and schools and community centers, and also sending money back home for relief and development. But the question now is, and I know a lot of people are asking, I'm sure a lot of people are asking as well, is now we need to give money locally, because if we don't, all of those issues will be impacted.
Yeah, and we shouldn't, again, you all know this, but it's, the national part of it is one part of it, but as you saw in the presentation, it is good there are more Muslims running on the local level, and we see that all over the country. But when we try to think about what MPAC's goal is, and other organizations, it's to have more Muslims in positions of influence. That's a big part of it. But we're not going to be able to leapfrog. Young Muslims, if they want to, and I would encourage this, they should be running at the school board level, the city council level, state representative level, and building their own constituencies on the local level and thinking long-term about, not that they should be very kind of like cutthroat about like, oh, I'm gonna plan to be like a senator in like 20 years and I'm gonna do all the things to get to that point. It's more organic than that, but you have to be embedded in a local community first. That's why I'll never be able to run for office, because I don't actually I'm not embedded in a local community in Virginia or Maryland like you are, and that's really important. You know.
Any questions, sisters, area before we take another one? No? Okay, we can go back.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Sultan Chowdhury. I'm a member of this community. And thank you, MCMC and MPEC and, Shadi, for coming here and sharing your valuable comments. Indeed, I like your presentations and the influence of Biden's and so on, and how, because that's a burning question in our mind. I think if Biden loses, most likely other communities will pick on us. The Muslims made him lose because all have to suffer under, because Trump is the other candidate. Having said that, I think we, as Shafiq Khan pointed out, how's our voting influence doing? And of course, we all know that it is because we are not still real organized. I'm kind of in the impatient team that why not? And it should have been this year. So now that MCMC and MPEC is here, my question to you is, what's the relationship with CARE Action, for example? Because we don't see a coherent recommendation from MCMC and CARE Action. So here we go, we have a District 6 candidate to come with two different recommendations. I'm not saying one is fault the other, but how about getting that done? And MPEC being national, of course, this is a friendly family conversation. I think people got to know you. We have been in the community for a long time, got involved in a few things, but hardly any people know that we have a national organization. And money is important, like it or not. And we are stingy, yes we are, but we cannot match the $1 billion APEC budget, but we can shoot for $150 million with the population that we have. 6 million people, $10 average per head makes us how much? 600 million, right? 60 times 10. 60 times 10. So, I want you to please address that and how to make it more forceful. I know primary is almost over, but national election is coming, so let's get to job. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one issue is that, which is sort of a disadvantage vis-a-vis compared to the Jewish community, is Arabs and Muslims have tended to be, there's Arab American organizations and then there's Muslim American organizations, and then Muslims have been divided amongst themselves on a number of different issues, and Arabs too. There's Arab Christian population that maybe has somewhat different politics than Arab Muslims. So, but I do think Gaza and the fact that it's been a rallying point for, I don't think I felt so personally and so strongly about an issue like this. Even post 9/11, I don't think quite compares, and the Iraq War doesn't compare to how intensely I felt this. And I think so, we can't always put words to it as to why. It hits so deeply and so hard that I do think this could be a moment where it galvanizes and also helps us put to the side some of these divisions. Yeah, we'll have those divisions, but at least on this, there should be some level of unity and also coordination between Arab and Muslim organizations and so forth. I don't know if this has already been done, but is there a kind of Muslim donor circle where you have the 50 richest self-identifying Muslim Americans and they do a kind of donor pledge where they commit to giving a certain amount of their wealth to political causes, and to be very explicit about that? I'm sure there's been efforts. I'm not really familiar with how far they've gotten, but I think that, small donors are great, but you need something more than that, because it is always hard. In theory, if we got 6 million Muslims to each give a certain amount, that would be amazing, but we're not going to be able to get the 6 million to all give. And we need big amounts of money. And that's where specific individual donors can direct millions of dollars to building institutions and building organizations. So I think,
Yeah, the challenge with pillars is that they give, it's that concept, but they give small amounts to multiple organizations, amounts from like $25 to $50,000, which really cannot build capacity at the level that we're talking about, right? So if you're dealing with political donations that are in the multi-millions, 50, 100, they're just not amounts that can scale organizations. I thought I'd talk a little bit about maybe some coordination between you all and Pierre.
Sure. And I know we're short on time, so I'll keep this as brief as possible. But so a couple things I just want to mention in terms of when we're talking about candidate recommendations, because that was one of your questions, right? Just to give some context, at least from speaking from an MCMC, Montgomery County Muslim Council perspective, let me take it one step further. All local organizations have been, I think, engaged and active like never before this election cycle. So there's that to start with, right? On the MCMC side, our candidate recommendations involved a multi-pronged process. It was meeting with not maybe all, but most of the candidates on multiple levels. We conducted candidate forums where we, as I mentioned, I think earlier, where we held sessions for the community where we got all the candidates for a particular race, whether it's Congressional District 6, whether it's for the Board of Education, et cetera. We sent out surveys and questionnaires for which we received feedback and responses. And to the best of our ability, we solicited community input as well. So there are a lot of different elements to the recipe, if you will, that went into the final product from an MCMC perspective. Other organizations did the same thing. I think definitely a lesson learned, as much as we want to celebrate and know that we've done the type of work which we haven't really done before, we definitely have room for improvement. Absolutely, right? And there's ways for us to get better. And a lot of that comes back to some simple things, which you think are like blocking and tackling, but we just need to be better at, which is communication and collaboration, right? It's not that hard to do. So one of the things we've already started discussing with a number of other organizations around Maryland, the other councils, other organizations, what have you, is once the primary is over, for all of us to get together, like I'll loosely use the term, have like a summit of sorts, right? To say, hey, first of all, learn from each other. What did you do? What did you do? So that we can get best practices from each other and raise each other. But also then figure out how do we better communicate and collaborate so that we're speaking with one voice, right? So there's definitely elements of that. The last thing I'll quickly just mention is, we're talking about making lots of changes and having, creating an opportunity for us to have more power, more voice in the overall process. And this is not to create excuses, and it's not to, well, I guess it's not to create excuses, but these are things, and Shadi, correct me if I'm wrong, these are generational changes we're talking about, right? These aren't changes that in one election cycle, we flip the switch and we've got all this power, right? So it's steps, it's climbing stairs, climbing a mountain. And so the work we've done now, it's foundational. It's setting the precedents for, and hopefully we have some small wins, right? But it's what's gonna lead to big wins maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now. But if we don't do the work now, those wins won't come later on.
Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and one example of a generational shift is, 20 years ago, when I was in college, people were talking about how, too many Muslims or the vast majority of Muslims are engineers and doctors. But a lot of my generation is the one that started moving in a different direction. And now we're seeing the results of that. It took time to see that play out. But what I mentioned, the fact that there are a lot of Muslims in government, on the Hill, there are more Muslims in journalism. That's because of a shift culturally that happened 20 or 25 years ago, where we started to normalize the idea that you don't have to be a doctor or an engineer. It may even be preferable, if you're inclined, to pursue other directions. And so I think that's the way we have to be thinking. And also the fact that we have more Arab and Muslim Americans in tech who are building, mini fortunes or maybe even more than that. And then 10 or 20 years down the road, as some of them become, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're really able to give more of their wealth, there's probably going to be shifts there as well. And we should be thinking about how to engage sort of rising Muslims in Silicon Valley. And I think one problem is that there's been a kind of risk averseness that there is, pre-October 7th, there was a sense that getting too much into Palestine could be a risky endeavor. And if you want to be mainstream and be in good standing, then maybe that's not the #1 issue to focus on. That has to change, and I think it will change, because there's no way any of us can just put Palestine to the side any longer. And it's not really even just about, but Palestine, I think, long conversation, represents something deeper about a disregard for, Muslim lives. It's not just about, Palestinians. And so I think that I will even admit there was, in different parts of my career, I didn't love getting into the Israel-Palestine debate. I did when necessary, when there was a conflict, but it wasn't my preference. That has changed for me, and I feel like there's no going back to this sense that we can kind of like keep our distance or focus. Obviously we can focus on other things, but we also have to focus on this, and I think that's what we've learned post October 7th. So I think that being able to send that message to people that it is now more of a mainstream topic. Pro-Palestine voices are there in the Washington Post, the New York Times. We have some of our leading congressmen and senators who are speaking out. It's not the way it was 10 years ago, where there was a big personal cost. Now it is okay. Yes, there might be some blowback, but there are a lot of mainstream figures who are rising to the occasion. And so we have no excuse to kind of say, well, we're not comfortable speaking out when we have, even Jewish, senators or Congress people who are calling for ceasefires. And there are, and so I think that, that presents, we have to think about it in those terms.
Any questions from the ladies before?
Yeah, I think the last, because we're almost done with time. Any questions from ladies? Okay, no, all right.
Can I add something to it too? Well, we can come back. Sorry, 1 minute.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for all of you being here. Appreciate putting this event. I had a comment and question on the MCMC actually reaching out to candidates for evaluation, for recommendations. How has that been done? I am a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Maryland, and I live in Montgomery County. And my campaign reached out a few times to several councils. And even in the Baltimore Muslim Council, they had a forum for our candidacy, and then they decided to cancel it. And then we haven't had any responses before that, except one response that we got from Prince George's County, that they already made a recommendation to endorse one candidate. So how is the communication within the Muslim community reached out to these candidates and the campaigns, and how is the communication actually being filtered? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can tell you that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So we did have a number of committee. My name is Isham Gardi. I'm on the board of Montgomery County Muslim Council. So we did have someone actually in charge of reaching out to all of the candidates, and all of the names that were on the website for the Montgomery County Board of Elections were reached out to. And I can tell you because I saw the emails, right? Not everybody responded to us. So I apologize if for whatever reason we missed your email, but I can guarantee you we have not received anything from you because I looked at those emails. So either we did not receive it in time, because when we set a forum date, that date, by the time we announce it, cannot be moved, if that makes any sense. When it was what done? The forum was what, Asif, do you remember the exact date? For the candidate, for the Senate? No, I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about Congress. No, we did not do a U.S. Senate because we had at the time the three leading candidates. None of them responded to us with a date. We gave 3 or 4 different dates. So the way you do a forum is you reach out to the leading candidates from polling perspective, right? And you see which one is available. So none of them responded to us. So as a result, we went with the meet and greets that we had done and the people that had reached out to us and had been engaged with us, and had the background reviews, had one-on-ones, had quite a few things. So that's what happened. I'm sorry, my apologies. I thought you were talking about the Congress seat. Yeah, the U.S. Senate. So, and I don't know about the other councils. You said PG. I know PG County had a very strong relationship with one of the candidates because they had worked with her quite a bit initially.
Any other questions?
Well, sorry, go ahead. We'll take last question.
Assalamu alaikum. So I'm curious, you speak of, senior Muslim political appointees, and of course you're probably well versed in policy circles. I'm curious, I had a friend who was a political appointee, just resigned from the administration just a couple of days ago in a very public, I'm resigning because of Palestine. And he said they got very empathetic responses from many senior members of the administration. And I'm wondering if the calculus of policy is just a raw political power decision, or is there any kind of weighing of the righteousness of a cause? We're not talking about moving a base from one state to another state, and whether it really doesn't matter in terms of, we're talking about a genocide. So how does the virtue of a cause factor into these policy discussions?
Yeah, well, there's basically 3 people who run Middle East policy. Obviously, Biden, Jake Sullivan, and then Brett McGurk, who is the coordinator for the Middle East in the White House. Brett McGurk, for those of you who know, has been pretty terrible on Middle East issues for like 10 years or more. He's been perpetually around and keeps on getting senior positions. But because Jake Sullivan doesn't like dealing with the Middle East, he sees the Middle East as a distraction from great power competition, China, Russia. He's sort of, the person who does day-to-day Middle East is Brett McGurk, and he has disproportionate power over policy, but he does fit in with Biden's approach. Biden is ideologically committed to Israel because he remembers, there's a lot of reasons for it, but he remembers when Israel was different, when it was kind of an underdog a long time ago in like the 50s and 60s, because he's really old. So he still has that memory. And so some of it is just different generations, and how if you follow developments in Israel in the past 20 years, all you know is right-wing politics and Netanyahu, and you don't have maybe as much of the idealized notion of an Israel that was just like starting out. So some of it has to do with Biden's personality, and that's why there's a limit to how much he can change. He just feels, and he feels Israel in his bones in a way that he doesn't seem to be able to extend that to Palestinians. And we can see this when he talks about Palestinians. There isn't the same emotional. Something is missing. He can't feel it in the same way. And politics, in the end, is partly about the visceral, emotional aspect. So my hope is, and this is something we all have to look forward to, I think, is that with a new generation of policymakers, I think you're going to have a different approach. It may not be ideally what we want, but at least we will have Americans who understand the Palestinian side of a debate more than some in the older generation. And I do think too that this is where I think making common cause with our Jewish colleagues and friends in organizations like J Street or Jewish Voices for Peace. One thing I'm worried about is just seeing the growing division between American Muslims and American Jews in a way that I just wouldn't have ever anticipated. And I see it even in my own friend group. So in my friend group in DC, there's sort of a sense that we can't really talk about these issues, and we just push these issues to the side. And you feel the tension whenever October 7th comes up and we don't really know how to talk to each other about this. So I think one challenge is, how do we still keep hope in reaching across the aisle, so to speak, with Jewish Americans who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Maybe they're not where we are, but they feel that something wrong is happening. But this is where the messaging comes into play as well. And this is maybe a bigger debate. This is where maybe some of the more alienating messaging, like from the river to the sea, like we understand it. We understand that it's not anti-Semitic, but if our Jewish brothers and sisters tell us like, oh, this is making it harder for us to get on board with your cause, we want to join with you, but this doesn't feel good for us. We're going to have to think about how we do our messaging if we want to build a broad-based movement. I'm 100% in support of the campus protests, but I'm not in support of this, maybe the small minority of the protesters who I think are falling to kind of very hardline rhetoric. And the question is, do we want to be a movement that's on the outside looking in, that doesn't have influence and is a kind of like a left-wing cause, or do we want to have a movement that speaks to a majority of Americans in a way they can relate to? And I think that's going to be the longer-term challenge. Can we move from campus protests to a kind of mainstream rhetoric that brings more people in the tent?
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We do have to wrap up now for Isha prayer. There's a couple of logistic things that I just wanted to mention briefly. One is that for those people who want to vote uncommitted, it's important to make sure there's an uncommitted marker in the Maryland ballot, or Maryland ballot, that allows you to do that. My understanding too, though, and I haven't looked further in the ballot myself, unfortunately, is that there's a slate of delegates that you also have to vote for that will go to the Democratic convention. I don't know if Hisham or Asif can comment on that, but you have to also look and see who they're committed to, because if they're committed to one of the candidates, they will go and they have the right to support that candidate. If they're uncommitted on that, they're supposed to be marked as uncommitted. So you lose your uncommitted vote if you vote for a, yeah, please.
Yeah, so this is it was something that we didn't provide a recommendation for, but it's basically on the ballot is where you can select individuals to represent the party at their what do they call it, the party convention, right? So there's the Democratic convention, the Republican convention, et cetera. And so, like, for example, if you want to vote, or if you are voting uncommitted, which we are recommending, there's only a very few options of delegate choices, right? But to some degree, I'd argue that it kind of doesn't matter, because ultimately whoever wins the presidential primary for each party, that candidates, delegates are going to go, right? Regardless of who we sort of vote for, if that makes sense. Is that clear or not? So let's say we all selected you're registered as a Democrat, and there's one or two individuals who are committed or who are can be a delegate as an uncommitted person, right? But if Biden ends up winning Maryland in the primary, then all of the Biden delegates are going to go to the convention regardless of how people voted. Does that make some sense? No. I think people are still confused. Let's catch up on this after Isha. Let's catch up on this after.
One other thing is that you don't have to stay home to abstain. You can not vote for a single office. So if you don't want to vote for the president, yeah, you can leave that one blank and you can go on. Okay. So we would like to wrap up. Obviously, the one thing that we can take as a message from this is that we all have a long, hard road ahead and a lot of work, and so it's going to take some patience and perseverance. So I'd like to end with a dua that Saul's army said when they were facing the army of Jalut, and it was رَبَّنَا أَفْرِغْ عَلَيْنَا صَبْرًا وَثَبِّتْ أَقْدَامَنَا وَانصُرْنَا عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الْكَافِرِينَ. Our Lord, please make our footholds strong, give us, make us steadfast and patient, and give us victory over the enemies. Thank you all.